Back in 2024, the real call was not that one strike or one speech would trigger everything. It was that Gaza, the Red Sea, Lebanon, and Iran's nuclear file were no longer separate crises. They were becoming one connected system. Once that system started moving, the region was always going to slide toward a wider confrontation involving Iran, Israel, and the United States. That is why my prediction now is not that one side suddenly wins and the others disappear. The likeliest end state is a negotiated freeze, dressed up as victory by every side. Washington will say it restored deterrence, Tehran will say it survived and forced the United States to bargain, and Israel will say it reset the regional balance. Not peace, not reconciliation, an ugly equilibrium that nobody loves, but everybody can live with for a while. Subscribe if you value analysis that tries to read the structure before the headlines catch up. What makes that outcome more likely is that the conflict has already shown its basic shape. The U.S.-Israeli campaign that began on February 28th produced a ceasefire that has mostly held for about a week, but it did not produce strategic closure. Talks in Islamabad continued after a tense first round. A new U.S. blockade on Iranian ports added pressure, and Lebanon remains outside the ceasefire framework, which means one of the most dangerous fronts is still open. That matters because the title question is not really about who can inflict damage. We already know the answer to that. The real question is, who can convert military pressure into a durable political result? So far, nobody has shown they can. Israel and the United States have demonstrated reach. They can strike deep, kill senior figures, and impose real costs. But Reuters reports that after more than 6 weeks of war, Iran still retains leverage through Hormuz. Its missile and nuclear infrastructure has not been politically solved, and Israel is still dealing with Hezbollah, Gaza, and unrest in the West Bank. Firepower has been real. Finality has not. The nuclear issue shows the same problem even more clearly. Before inspectors lost access, the IAEA estimated that, as of June 13, 2025, Iran had accumulated 440.9 kilograms of uranium enriched up to 60% U-235. In its March 2026 report, the agency said it could not provide information on the current size, composition, or whereabouts of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile because it no longer had access to the relevant enrichment facilities. That is not a file that has been resolved by bombing. It is a file that has been forced back into negotiation precisely because force left too much uncertainty behind. Tell me in the comments which piece of this conflict matters most to the ending: Hormuz, Lebanon, Gaza, or the nuclear file? The hidden clock in this war is not only military, it is economic. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says nearly 20% of global oil supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz, and its April outlook describes the strait as effectively closed to normal shipping traffic since the war began. The IEA went even further, calling the March shock the largest disruption in the history of the global oil market, with global oil supply down 10.1 million barrels per day. That is the kind of pressure that narrows every government's room for rhetoric. Once energy, shipping, inflation, and growth all start tightening at the same time, maximalist war aims become much harder to sustain. Reuters reported that hopes for renewed talks were enough to pull oil back below the most panicked levels, while the IMF cut global growth forecasts as the conflict weighed on the outlook. Even Britain and France have distanced themselves from the U.S. blockade rather than join a wider confrontation. That is what strategic fatigue looks like before leaders admit it publicly. That is also why I do not think this ends with regime change in Tehran or with some clean military collapse of the Iranian state. The appetite is not there. The coalition is not there. And the cost of pushing further is becoming visible to too many actors at once. Washington, European allies, Gulf states, import-dependent Asian economies, and Israel itself. Iran, meanwhile, does not need to look strong everywhere to survive this. It only needs to deny its enemies the clean outcome they promised. If the regime stays in place, if part of the nuclear file is converted into a bargain instead of a surrender, and if Hormuz remains powerful enough to force outside powers back to the table, Tehran can present that as proof that coercion failed to break it. Hit like if this kind of structural breakdown helps you see the pattern behind the daily noise. What emerges from that is not a grand peace, but a layered settlement. One track will center on nuclear constraints, monitoring, and the fate of enriched material. Another will focus on sanctions relief and maritime security. Another will try to keep Lebanon from becoming the trigger for the next regional spiral. Reuters says the Islamabad Channel is already orbiting sanctions, nuclear guarantees, Hormuz, and regional security, while U.S.-mediated Israel-Lebanon talks are happening in parallel, even as Hezbollah rejects the process. That is messy. It is also exactly what real endgames look like when no side can impose a total settlement. So my prediction is narrower than the rhetoric and more realistic than the propaganda. Washington will eventually accept constraint instead of transformation. Tehran will accept pressure instead of capitulation. Israel will get a tougher regional security environment for Iran, but not the disappearance of Iran as a power. Each side will claim it achieved the essential objective. Each side will know privately that it settled for less. That still changes the region. A war like this does not end and leave the old order intact. It hardens the centrality of Hormuz. It deepens the role of energy disruption in strategic bargaining. It confirms that the nuclear issue cannot be bombed out of existence, and it leaves every regional actor with the same lesson. The next crisis will not start from zero, because this one has already rewritten the map of risk. Share this with someone who still thinks this ends with a simple battlefield victory, because that is the least likely outcome on the board. That is why I think the conflict ends the way many consequential conflicts really end. Not with surrender, but with exhaustion. Not with trust, but with deterrence. Not with a clean finale, but with a cold, unstable balance that every side publicly celebrates and privately understands is incomplete. The language will sound triumphant. The reality will be narrower. A negotiated freeze disguised as victory by every side. And if that is where this goes, then the deeper 2024 prediction holds up too. The point was never that the region would explode forever. It was that once these fronts fused into one system, they would force a reckoning no actor could fully control. That reckoning is now visible. What comes out of it will be more fragmented, more transactional, and more dangerous than the old order, but also more honest about the limits of power. This conflict was never moving toward a clean ending. It was moving toward an ugly equilibrium.